Europe in a political storm, understanding the populist rage. European elites are facing the wrath of the rebellious masses and pitchforks. Welcome to Geopolitics Demystified, where we bring in perspectives you do not see or hear in the mainstream media. I'm your host, S.L. Kanthan. Today's topic is about Europe, its dismal condition, and the EU, a totalitarian nightmare. A shockwave swept through Europe during the European Parliament elections last week as the nationalists and so-called far-right parties gained a significant number of seats in France, Germany, Italy, and others. This was the voice of the silent majority, who are fed up with the EU, as well as the leaders of their own countries in terms of the economy, jobs, wages, immigration, crime, wars, and the fundamental fabric of the society. More importantly, this is not a one-time event, but rather the beginning of a populist tsunami that is going to intensify over the coming years. When Brexit and Trump happened in 2016, globalists did not learn their lessons and instead doubled down on their destructive policies. Now they are facing the wrath of the rebellious masses with pitchforks. Let's analyze what is happening, why, and how Europe can save itself. First, let's take a look at what happened in France and Germany, the two biggest economies in the EU. In France, Macron got trounced by Marine Le Pen, the right-wing political leader who has been demonized and written off by mainstream media and pundits for a long time. Her party, National Rally, won a staggering 94% of all the French districts. However, because the population is concentrated in big cities, the results translated to 30% of the votes, which was still twice as big as Macron's party. In the end, Le Pen's party won 30 out of 81 seats allocated to France in the European legislative body. In response, President Macron took a political gamble and dissolved the National Assembly. This means France will vote for its own parliament on June 30th and July 7th, and will almost certainly have a new prime minister chosen from Marine Le Pen's party. The new PM will be Jordan Bardella, a young 28-year-old who is very popular on TikTok. If the right coalition does well, Marine Le Pen will be the French president in 2027. It must be noted that the so-called far-right Le Pen has softened her image over the recent years. She is now pro-Israel, pro-EU, and pro-NATO. Her anti-immigration and anti-globalism are what makes her stand apart now. Once considered a friend of Putin, she is also now less outspoken about aid to Ukraine. How about Germany? Here, the hard-right AfD, Alternative for Germany, came in second and crushed the party of Chancellor Scholz, whose Social Democratic Party came third, scoring its worst ever EU election result. The Greens, part of Scholz's coalition, also suffered a humiliating defeat, losing 9 of their 25 seats. The AfD will have 15 seats in the EU Parliament. This is remarkable considering that the German establishment was toying with the idea of banning AfD a few months ago. The coalition of the ruling party combined got only 30% of the votes. In other words, 70% of Germans rejected the current government. This is a stunning blow to the ruling class and globalists. Overall, the so-called far-right will have about one-third of the seats in the EU Parliament, enough to stop any legislation they oppose. Just like Trump's America First, there will soon be ideologies such as Germany First and France First. By the way, I keep saying so-called far-right because they would have been called center-left just 30 years ago. The globalists have moved their policies so far to the left that mainstream and common sense philosophy have now become far-right. Thus, the pendulum is just swinging back after 2 decades of extreme politics. Okay, that is about what is happening. Now, to understand this radical transformation, let's take a look at the why, the reasons. In all societies, people want stability and prosperity to be happy. Looking at Europe, we can see neither has occurred. There has been one crisis after another over the last 2 decades, and the economy has been stagnant since the great financial crisis of 2008. Europe is being Japanified. Consider the period of 11 years, 2008 to 2019. China's GDP grew more than 200%. The US grew 45%. As for the EU, it grew 0%. Actually, it was a bit negative, like minus 3%. This was the lost decade in Europe, which faces the real prospect of long-term stagnation like Japan. Some countries, the pigs, as Goldman Sachs called Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain, were devastated by Wall Street's mortgage fraud and were crushed further for many years by the cruel austerity imposed by the European Central Bank. And then came COVID, followed by the Ukraine war, and then loss of cheap Russian oil and gas. In 2023, many countries like Germany and the Netherlands were in recession. The middle class is shrinking in much of Europe, and wages adjusted for inflation are down quite a bit. Half of all French workers now make less than 2,000 euros a month, which is barely enough to meet basic needs. Poverty rate is 20% in the UK, France, and many others. It is no wonder that there have been many massive protests in Europe in the last few years. For example, the Yellow Jackets in France and many farmers' protests all over Europe. If you went to Europe 15 years ago, you would rarely see homeless people or drug addicts on the street. But now there are nearly 1 million homeless people in Europe. In Germany, which is the economic powerhouse of Europe, rapid and sometimes permanent deindustrialization is underway. Many crucial sectors like steel, chemicals, and automotive industries are shutting down plants. The famous Mittelstand, the small-medium business that is the backbone of the German economy, is being crippled by taxes, regulations, and high costs of energy. Companies that have been around for 100 or 200 years have gone bankrupt in the last 2 years. Europe is also losing out on the corporate world. Take Germany, UK, and France, which combined had 114 Fortune 500 firms in 2000. Fast forward to 2023, that number had fallen from 114 to just 73, a drop of 36%. Meanwhile, China's representation in the Fortune 500 list grew from 10 to a staggering 142. Similarly, Europe, which was once the epicenter of science and technology, has dropped significantly in innovation, tech startups, unicorns, IPO, patents, etc. There are no European countries to compete with the likes of Google, Amazon, Microsoft, and Nvidia. In critical technologies like cloud computing, artificial intelligence, semiconductors, and quantum computing, Europe is nowhere to be seen. In electric cars, China is so ahead of Europe that once esteemed companies like BMW are seeking joint ventures with Chinese companies to acquire technologies. And unable to compete, Europe is also planning on raising tariffs on imported Chinese electric cars. Although European car makers like Volkswagen sell half of their cars in China. Social structure. If the economy is bad, Europeans also have to deal with another shock: the rapid change in demographics and values due to legal migration, illegal immigration, and refugees from US-led wars in the Middle East, Africa, Afghanistan, etc. There are now 5 to 6 million illegal immigrants in Europe, and tens of millions of migrants and refugees have poured into the continent since the US launched its fake war on terror 2 decades ago. Would a corporation employ workers without a resume or an interview? No. So why would Europe invite millions of people without ensuring they have the right skills and attitude? Also, this mass migration has nothing to do with humanitarian goodwill. Destroying a nation, creating tens of millions of refugees, and accepting a small fraction of them is illogical and demented. If Europe wants to help Africa or the Middle East, go build infrastructure there. Schools, hospitals, highways, railways, seaports, airports, etc. Oh, there's someone else doing it already. China. Yes. Go join the Belt and Road Initiative and help the Africans, so they wouldn't have to risk their lives to illegally enter Europe. Within a few short years, many European cities have changed dramatically, making the natives feel like strangers in their own country. For example, in London, white British make up only 36% of the population. In the entire UK, Mohammed has been the most popular name among newborn boys for many years now. In France, a third of the people under the age of 60 have immigrant ancestry. There's no doubt that whites will be a minority in Europe within 20 to 30 years. So when right-wing parties talk about the Great Replacement Theory or Islamization of Europe, it resonates with a lot of people. Worse, the multiculturalism project seems to be an abject failure. 1. Most newcomers to Europe struggle with language and culture. Some are just likely to become a burden on the society. For example, many Syrian refugees coming to Germany had not even completed high school. How are they going to integrate into the society and become productive citizens? In France, many immigrants, even second or third generation, live in ghettos, receive substandard education, face discrimination while seeking jobs, and are harassed by the police. Many parts of Paris look worse than a third world country now. It's a lose-lose situation for Europe and the immigrants. The entire migration process is also deeply flawed because Europe did not have any vetting process, which means many criminals and terrorists also sneaked in along with real refugees. At one point, there were estimated 23,000 jihadists in the UK alone. Intelligence agencies estimated there were about 200 ISIS suicide bombers in Europe. Think about that. A few years back, there were horrible terrorist attacks all over Europe, although that seems to have subsided now. However, crime in migrant neighborhoods is still a real problem. Consider Sweden, which was once a model for a high-trust society. Now, 20% of the population are foreign-born migrants, many from Somalia. In 2015 alone, Sweden took 160,000 refugees, mostly from Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And the once peaceful country is now in the grip of gun shootings and drug-related gang wars. It's not uncommon for criminals to even use grenades. Children aged 12 and 13 have been caught with automatic weapons, while younger boys act as street corner lookouts for the mobsters. The gun murder rate in Stockholm, capital of Sweden, is 30 times that of London on a per capita basis. Brutal and gang rapes are also more common now. Such violence was unheard of in Europe 2 decades ago. As the Swedish Prime Minister said recently, Sweden has never before seen anything like this. No other country in Europe is seeing anything like this. There are also many no-go zones in various European cities where native white Europeans or even the police do not dare to go. After years of denial, finally the mainstream media and the establishment are talking about it a little bit now, but they use euphemisms. For example, no-go zones are now called vulnerable zones, and poverty and inequality are being blamed without going into details. More atrocious is the fact that political correctness in media and politics hide all the problems regarding mass immigration. One cannot get answers to simple questions like how many foreign-born migrants are there in Europe? How many illegal immigrants are there? How many crimes are committed by migrants? What percentage of prisoners are migrants? All the statistics are fudged. Moreover, native Europeans cannot even complain about any of the social issues for the fear of either getting banned on social media or even getting arrested. There's suffocating censorship from the leftist establishment. With all these, why is it surprising that far-right political parties have become very popular in Europe? There are more dysfunctional aspects to mainstream politics. Europeans are told that they need immigration because the population is decreasing. Yes, it's true. The fertility rate in the EU is well below 2.1, the minimum required to maintain the population. For example, it's 1.46 in Germany, 1.24 in Italy, and 1.16 in Spain. Looking at the newborn babies in Europe, the number has fallen by almost 50% over the last 60 years, from 6.8 million in 1964 to 3.8 million last year. So, considering the dire situation, one would think that European leaders would encourage traditional families, marriage, and children. Instead, the establishment spreads degeneracy, wokeness, and every value that is against nuclear families and procreation. During the G7 meeting this year, Macron tried very hard to insert pro-abortion language in the communique. Given all this, it should not be surprising that when a right-wing journalist or politician claims that Muslims, feminists, LGBTQ activists, and every other marginalized group are part of a grand conspiracy to exterminate the heterosexual white male, it does not sound crazy to many Europeans anymore. Perpetual wars. After the end of the Cold War, Europe could have pursued peace and development by embracing Russia and focusing on the development of Eurasia. If Europeans had any understanding of geoeconomics, they would have foreseen the rise of Asia. And if they had any grasp of geopolitics, they would have shut down NATO, or at least would have prevented the expansion of NATO. Instead, European leaders went along with the warmongering ideas of the American empire and approved all the terrible ideas: NATO expansion, wars on Yugoslavia and Serbia, two wars and barbaric sanctions on Iraq, bombing of Afghanistan for 2 decades, which was about spending $1 million to drop missiles on guys making $1 a day, absurd wars on extremely poor countries like Somalia and Yemen, extending decades-long sanctions on Iran, completely unnecessary regime change wars on Libya and Syria, and the maniacal proxy war on Ukraine using neo-Nazis. Worse, having learned nothing, you are still supporting Israel's genocidal war on Gaza and possible escalations that would bring Lebanon, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, and Iran into a massive regional war. Do you want more refugees, Europe? Why, Europe? Why? All these wars brought nothing but disaster for you. Tens of millions of refugees, opium and heroin from Afghanistan, religious fanatics from the Middle East, chaos for your society, trillions of euros wasted, and your civilization possibly destroyed forever. America wins by destruction of Europe. It is quite surprising that Europeans do not understand the basic divide-and-rule strategies of geopolitics. After all, European empires were once very good at it. Today, it is a strategic imperative that Europe must understand how the US operates. Take Russia, for example. It is in the best interest of Europe to have good relations with a neighbor that is the largest nation on earth by landmass and has vast amounts of cheap energy and natural resources and has 6,000 nuclear weapons. The symbiotic relationship between Russia and Europe is essential for the success of both. Looking at the big picture, consider Eurasia, which is a supercontinent with 70% of the world population and 65% of GDP. A peaceful Eurasia where everyone is focused on trade, development, and technology would bring tremendous prosperity and free everyone from the endless wars of the American empire. If this is not obvious, American strategists and think tanks have made it very clear. For example, Brzezinski wrote about how the US should subjugate its vassals in Europe. And George Friedman, the founder of Stratfor, spoke about dividing Russia and Germany back in 2015. This is what he said in a speech. The primordial interest of the US is to split Russia and Germany, because together they will challenge US hegemony. If you go back in history, it was obvious how the destruction of Europe led to the rise of the US. It was only after World War I that the US dollar gained a little bit of global usage. And when Europe destroyed itself again in World War II, the US gathered everyone in 1944 and made them sign the Bretton Woods Agreement that created the king dollar. When World War II ended, Europe was in ruins, and the US became the new empire, ending centuries of European preeminence, the empires of Spain, Portugal, Netherlands, France, and Britain. Thus, Geopolitics 101 dictates that the US would not let Europe rise again. This strategy includes NATO, whose goal was originally to keep the Russians out, Germans down, and Americans in. And it has not changed a bit over the last 70 years. Moreover, the US empire is facing existential crises. Dollar hegemony is on the cusp of demise. After all, no global reserve currency lasts forever. And a huge de-dollarization effort is on the way, as we discussed in our previous podcast. And the US is losing to China in terms of economy and technology. Also, the American society is deeply polarized and possibly on the cusp of a civil war. Thus, the managers of the empire need a great reset, which involves crushing all its geopolitical competitors and, if necessary, burning down the world to rule over the ashes. This is why the Ukraine war is happening. This is why the US blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. This is why the US is driving a wedge between Europe and China. This is why the US is deindustrializing Germany, the industrial powerhouse of Europe. And this is why the US destroys numerous nations and then sends refugees to Europe. Many American politicians and pundits have said openly that the Ukraine war is a great investment because Ukraine will fight Russia to the last Ukrainian. Think about that for a moment. If every Ukrainian dies while fighting Russia, the US will consider that a good deal. Well, guess what? The US will soon say the same about Europeans. So if there is a nuclear war between Russia and Europe, the US would be cheering it on. You may be wondering why European politicians and media are not fighting back. It's because the US has the entire European establishment under its thumb. One way to accomplish this is through extensive spying. This is why the US fought so hard to remove Huawei 5G equipment from Europe. In conclusion, here is the simple truth. The biggest enemy of Europe is the United States of America, not Russia, not China. Will the nationalists and populists of Europe understand the truth and free the continent from the clutches of the American empire? The next topic, EU, the totalitarian nightmare. Finally, let's take a look at the European Union, which is deceptively organized to give an illusion of democracy, but is in fact a totalitarian nightmare. The EU is undemocratic and unelected technocracy created by globalists. It is essentially a new country made out of all the European nations. Through deception and propaganda, and largely without referendums, the European bankers and elites have trapped the European nations in the web of the EU. Below is a quote of Jean Monnet, the father of the EU, from the 1940s. Europe's nations should be guided towards the superstate without their people understanding what's happening. This can be accomplished by successive steps, each disguised as having an economic purpose, but which will eventually and irreversibly lead to federation. The simple naked truth is that the European nation is a suprastate, a modern empire, and a neoliberal project that has been created out of 27 countries. It also plans to add potentially 14 more countries. It's a single market of 500 million people, potentially adding another 150 million, that is controlled by one private bank, the European Central Bank. Multinational corporations can use a single lever in Brussels to control what and how the entire Europe consumes from cradle to birth: food, consumer goods, pharmaceuticals, etc. Soon there will be EU police, EU army, and EU intelligence security apparatus. Then there will be EU lawmakers dictating the budgets and domestic policies of all individual countries. The EU's bullying of countries like Hungary and Poland to accept migrants and refugees is just the preview of a totalitarian future. The enormous difficulty faced by the UK after Brexit also shows that the EU is like Hotel California. You can check out, but you can never leave. The EU means the death of sovereign nations in Europe. Europeans were promised prosperity, but as we discussed before, things are not peachy for the EU economy. Austerity, a nice word for plundering a country, has been the bitter medicine shoved down the throats all across Europe. The great financial crisis of 2008 wrecked Europe, and there has been no real recovery for most people since then. On top of these, add in terrorist attacks and the deluge of millions of refugees and migrants, you have the perfect storm of discontent. From 2008 to 2022, the ECB printed whopping 7 trillion euros, created artificial bubbles and bursts, bailed out its favorite banks, sent interest rates into the negative territory, and forced privatization of vast assets in Greece, Spain, Italy, etc. The ECB is also pushing the European governments into ever-increasing debt. Every country in the EU has a higher debt-to-GDP ratio today than in 2007, before the crash. In 2008, the EU's GDP was larger than that of the US. Now, the EU is 25% smaller than the EU. What a disaster. Europeans know nothing about the EU. Who runs the EU? It seems like a simple question, but surprisingly, most Europeans cannot even describe the major institutions of the EU and how they really work. The average European cannot identify the members of European Commission, Council of the European Union, and European Parliament. You can safely assume that, except for the bureaucrats, not a single European has read the entire European Constitution and the mind-boggling treaties which keep amending it. If you have insomnia, you can read the 200-plus pages of the EU Constitution passed by Lisbon Treaty in 2008. Inherently anti-democratic. More importantly, the EU is inherently anti-democratic. Of all the institutions, the people get to vote for only one, the European Parliament. How ridiculous is that? Europeans don't get to vote for the members in the Council of EU or the EU Commission. For Americans, imagine a system in which you don't get to vote for the US President or the US Senators. It's not surprising that the unelected bodies are actually the most powerful ones in the EU. The EU Commission is where legislation begins. The EU Parliament, the powerless branch that Europeans actually get to vote for, is just a rubber stamp. On social media, who speaks for the EU? Is Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the EU Commission. She's also there for G7 and G20 meetings. She's the one who flies to China to negotiate with Xi Jinping. You don't see anyone from the EU Parliament, a useless body for which Europeans are allowed to vote with great fanfare. And what is a day in the EU Parliament like? Imagine a meeting with 751 people who speak 23 different languages. It's the perfect place to take naps all day long. The EU really hates the peasants. The EU is not of the people and by the people, the definition of democracy. EU's elites have clearly shown their contempt for referendums and democracy. When Denmark and Ireland rejected the EU constitutions in 1992 and 2008 respectively, they were made to vote again for the same concept. As the Belgian Prime Minister famously said, if the answer is no, the vote will have to be done again because it absolutely has to be yes. When the Lisbon Treaty in 2008 was rejected by France and the Netherlands in referendums in 2005, the elites changed the rules and got the treaty approved by politicians. In fact, there was only one EU country that had a referendum on the Lisbon Treaty, which actually passed only after the second vote, and that was Ireland. Afterwards, Jean-Claude Juncker, president of the EU Commission, made it clear there can be no democratic choice against the European treaties. Bureaucratic nightmare. There are also about 50,000 highly paid, faceless bureaucrats, Eurocrats, who spend their days devising rules and regulations to control every aspect of an average person's life. There are 10,000 Eurocrats who make more money than the British Prime Minister, and their compensations, especially for the ministers, are generous beyond belief, including $200,000 a year salary, income tax as low as 8%, $400 daily allowance for simply showing up at the parliament for work, $60,000 a year allowance for things like computers and phones, $400,000 a year for staffing that can include family members like wives, and a whole slew of subsidies for relocation, housing, children's private schools, healthcare, entertainment, etc. Put together, the wages and benefits add up to more than $1 million a year. But their insular world is open to another class of elites, the lobbyists. There are more than 12,000 registered lobbying groups manipulating the Eurocrats to sneak in favored legislation and rules. Hundreds of U.S. corporations, such as Google, also spend enormous money bribing the Eurocrats. Thanks to this corruption via lobbying, the EU has come up with preposterous regulations such as bottled water cannot claim that it helps dehydration. Someone from Gatorade must be behind this one. Or prunes cannot be sold as having laxative effect. Probably Big Pharma behind that one. With a great zeal to justify their lucrative jobs, the bureaucrats have come up with gargantuan documents on even simple items such as apples and eggs. For example, a large egg must be more than 62 grams but less than 72 grams. And a red apple must be at least 50% red. Then someone came up with a wonderful idea of cutting electricity consumption and ordered that all new toasters, vacuum cleaners, hair dryers, etc. must use 30% less energy. The climate change theology. Of course, people who tried out the new toasters complained that they had to use the toaster 4 times to brown the bread. So people end up using more electricity than before. What's next? Globalists will fight tooth and nail to preserve the EU. It's their ultimate dream that's been in the works for a century. However, if Europeans don't wake up and demand extraordinary changes, the entire continent faces a dreadful future. Using mass immigration, terrorism, climate change, and wars as excuses, the EU elites will impose more austerity and implement mass surveillance, censorship, and other authoritarian systems. Conclusion. While the shift in Europe's politics is a bit hopeful, will the new leaders be smart enough to understand all the points we discussed in this podcast? If the new leaders focus just on immigration and Islam, they would not stop the Japanification of Europe. To be truly successful, they must invigorate the economy, focus on reindustrialization of Europe, normalize relations with Russia, simultaneously cooperate and compete with China, help Africa develop, and establish strategic autonomy that is free from the clutches of the USA. More urgently, they must end the war in Ukraine this year. Let's see. The end.